Hi, I'm Adam Tomasi, and I'm here to give some strategy analysis for Champion Briefs. For more great prep and analysis, check out this month's brief. So I'll be talking about the federalism disadvantage. On this year's March-April resolution resolved the United States to guarantee the right to housing. The argument with this disadvantage is that the affirmative's federal action to guarantee the right to housing would overstep the boundaries of the traditional federal-state relationship, for which land use decisions and matters of zoning and housing are traditionally considered the purview of states, cities, etc., meaning that the affirmative would be overstepping the boundaries that ought to be placed on the federal government, and that creates a host of problems. This is often paired with the state's counterplan to have all 50 states in America act on the affirmative's proposal in unison. The argument there is that the negative can just do whatever the affirmative does with a net benefit of preserving federalism, which makes it imperative for the affirmative to both prove a solvency deficit to the counterplan, that the counterplan is insufficient to solve for the affirmative harms, as well as prove that there is not a disadvantage to the affirmative, that the affirmative does not undermine federalism to this large degree, or maybe that federalism is bad. We'll talk about a lot of the avenues that the affirmative could pursue in order to win a debate against this strategy, though we'll primarily focus on the federalism disad. The two routes that I think you'd want to take against the counterplan are, first, to define United States as meaning the 50 states. This is something you could say in the 1AR to justify the permutation. Permutation due to the counterplan. The argument here is that because the resolution only says the United States, that the affirmative was just the states the whole time. I don't think this is something the affirmative has to say in the 1AC. I think it's better to leave your advocacy statement intentionally vague, and then when the state's counterplan is introduced, to say in the 1AR, the United States means the states. This isn't an advocacy shift because I affirmed the resolution as literally written, and it's obvious that the U.S. equals the states. Of course, for the negative to beat this argument, they have to raise definitions of their own of what the United States means, that it implies the federal government, and all the negative and affirmative have to do here is just introduce cards. I don't think you have to make this its own tea debate or something. But more to the point, I think that the affirmative also needs to argue that federal leadership or federal involvement is in some way necessary to ensure that the right to housing is effectively realized, and that all 50 states acting alone would be insufficient to solve for the affirmative. I'm sure there's lots of evidence that speaks to whether federal authority ought to take place. And if so, that's a net benefit to the affirmative that the counterplan cannot achieve. So that's the best way to beat the counterplan. But to beat the disadvantage, there are a lot of routes you can take. The first is to argue for alternative causes. So if you read evidence about a bunch of other issues that are complicating federalism right now, where the federal government is overstepping its boundaries, how federalism might be dead in the status quo, all of these mean that the affirmative does not uniquely cause a collapse in federalism, and that the status quo should already trigger the impact that the negative has raised. Meaning that this disad is not a reason to vote negative, because if you're voting for the status quo, then the status quo is already going to create these problems. Second is you can argue for the link turn. So whereas the negative has offered a model of dual federalism, that there ought to be an explicit delineation between what the federal government can do and what the state governments can do. The affirmative can argue for a cooperative federalism, where the federal government sets a floor of standards for housing policy that the states can then exceed and innovate upon. A good example for this is minimum wage laws, where the federal government has set a minimum of $7.25, and the states have the freedom to stick with that or exceed it. Another example of cooperative federalism is the Clean Air Act, where the federal government has set standards for the regulation of air pollution and cooperates with the states on enforcement. So this provides an adequate role for both the federal government and the states to work together without the federal government overreaching or the states having too much control. I think that when you're arguing for the link turn, you want to say that there's a problem where the states have too much control, and that creates problems, and that the affirmative is the best balance. So this is really a debate over whether the affirmative or the negative provides the proper balance of federal and state authority and the impacts that that could create. The third route that you could take is to argue for the impact turn. Though if you're doing this, you don't want to say anything else on the disadvantage, because you could be complicating your story there, like double turning yourself, or you enable the negative to just kick out of the disad. I think in a short LD1AR, if you're going to impact turn it, just impact turn it. You could even kick the F if you wanted to. If you had 4 minutes of cards ready to go on federalism is bad, then you could easily kick the affirmative and just read 4 minutes of cards. And that would be a really effective affirmative strategy, because it forces the 2NR to do a lot of work and explanation, and it gives the 2AR a lot of leeway with explanation, because you're explaining cards that were read in the 1AR rather than having to explain an affirmative that you already had to explain in the 1AR and package. So I think that that's really effective, especially when the negative has very little prep time. I find that a lot of LDers waste their prep time before the 1NC, when they could have organized some stuff before the debate, even if they didn't know what the AF was. And subsequently, I think that when the 2NR only has 30 seconds left to prep going into it, I think that the 1AR impact turn strategy is kind of devastating. I think that another route that the affirmative could take, and ought to take really, is that the affirmative case outweighs the impacts of the federalism DA. So let's say the negative argued that other countries model our approach to federalism, and that if they model it poorly because we've sent a bad example, then that results in nuclear war somehow. Like it might undermine the economy, or it might undermine U.S. leadership or something. And the affirmative were to say instead that guaranteeing the right to housing was key to revitalizing our economy. The affirmative could say that economic decline, absent a right to housing, would also complicate U.S. leadership and our ability to send an example abroad, and that economic decline would also in and of itself cause nuclear war in a very quick time frame, which would make all of the negatives impacts happen a lot quicker and become even worse. So that would be to say that the case outweighs the disad on magnitude, time frame, probability, and so on, which are all the words you need to be using so that you effectively package your affirmative in relation to the disad, because if you win a very high risk of the affirmative case impacts, then it doesn't, even if the negative is one, a very high risk of their disad, if your affirmative case takes priority, then you win the debate. If you're reading a more philosophical case, I think that you still want to say something about the disad other than just utilitarianism is wrong, because I think that when philosophy debaters straight up drop a disad, that it becomes very difficult for them to win the ethics debate when the negative can win that the affirmative guarantees extinction. Whereas if the affirmative presses the validity of the disad, talks about why it's silly, why there are missing internal links, how do you get from the right to housing to decline of all federalism to global nuclear war, I think that the affirmative is more persuasive than in saying, we shouldn't jettison fundamental human rights for the sake of some minute risk of extinction. But you can't really say, why do this for a minute risk of extinction if you concede the disad, because then there's a 100% risk. So you need to be able to answer the disad on some level. But I think that weighing and that interaction is really important. Whether you're link turning the disad or impact turning the disad, or making a uniqueness press, which is especially what you should be doing when you link turn the disad, because if you link turn a disad without uniqueness, then you're not going to have any offense. I think that at that point you give the affirmative a lot of options, because in your 2AR you have the option of kicking your affirmative case and going all in on the 2AR on federalism is low now, but that the affirmative is key to revitalize it in the future, thereby accessing the negatives impacts. That's a really effective 2AR option as well, because it gives the 2AR the ability to really focus in on one issue and give a lot of explanation to it based upon 1AR cards that were read. So those are some really effective affirmative strategies against the federalism disad, but above all, cut great cards, really research the issues, and you'll be giving some amazing speeches. So that's all I have. I hope you learned a lot, And if you have any questions, just post in the comments and I'd be more than willing to answer. And again, this was Adam Tomasi for Champion Briefs. For more awesome prep and analysis, check out this month's brief. Thank you.